The dust from Sunday morning services still clung to Rose Harper's black cotton dress when she heard the whispers following her down Sheridan's main street, each word sharper than the Wyoming wind that whipped through the mountain valley in the autumn of 1878. She had made the mistake of thinking a small town near the Bighorn Mountains might offer her a fresh start, but the church women had recognized something in her bearing, in the way she carried herself with too much knowledge for a supposedly unmarried woman of 22, and they had extracted her story piece by painful piece until they had enough fragments to condemn her. Rose quickened her pace past the general store, past the saloon that would not open for another few hours, past the blacksmith shop where the forge sat cold on the Lord's Day. Her modest room above the seamstress shop waited for her, the only space she could afford with the meager wages she earned mending clothes and taking in laundry. The seamstress, Mrs. Adelaide Chen, a Chinese woman who had married a railroad worker and been widowed young, was one of the few people in Sheridan who did not treat Rose like contaminated goods. The whispers had started 3 weeks ago when Rose had finally attended services after months of avoiding them. She had thought enough time had passed, that she had traveled far enough from Kansas City and the life she had been forced into at 16 when her father sold her to pay his gambling debts. 6 years in a brothel had taught her more about survival than any schoolroom, and when the madam who owned her had died unexpectedly, Rose had taken her carefully hoarded savings and run. She had ridden trains and stagecoaches, worked as a cook and a laundress, slowly making her way west until she found Sheridan tucked against the mountains, beautiful and harsh and seemingly far enough away from everything she wanted to forget. But small towns had a way of demanding explanations, and the churchwomen had a particular talent for extracting confessions. Rose had been foolish enough to think honesty might earn her acceptance. Instead, it had earned her isolation. She climbed the narrow stairs to her room and closed the door, leaning against it as tears she refused to shed in public burned behind her eyes. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Chen moving around in her own quarters, the soft shuffle of slippers on wood floors, the gentle clink of a teapot. Rose took a shaking breath and moved to the small wash basin, splashing cool water on her face before changing out of her church dress into the simple work clothes she wore for laundry. The afternoon stretched before her, empty except for the mending she needed to finish before Monday morning. She had just settled into the chair by the window with a torn shirt that needed new buttons when she heard boots on the stairs, heavy and unfamiliar. A knock sounded at her door, firm but not aggressive. Rose set down her mending and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" "Name is Nathan Jenkins, miss. Mrs. Chen said you might have time to do some mending for me. I have got 3 shirts that need repair, and nobody else in town will take the work from a stranger." His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that suggested Texas or maybe Oklahoma territory. Rose cracked the door open, keeping the chain latched, and found herself looking at a tall man in his mid-20s with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that needed cutting. He held his hat in his hands, revealing a face that was more rugged than handsome, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of creek water in summer. Dust covered his clothes, and she could see the outline of a gun belt beneath his worn leather vest. "I am a cowboy working at the Double R Ranch about 10 miles north," Nathan continued when she did not speak. "Just got hired on last week, and I need these shirts fixed before I run out of clean ones to wear. Mrs. Chen said you do good work and charge fair prices." Rose studied him for a moment longer. The Double R Ranch was owned by the Roberts family, respectable enough. And the man did not have the look of someone who meant her harm. She unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. "Let me see the shirts." Nathan handed them over, and Rose examined each one with a practiced eye. 2 needed buttons replaced and seams reinforced. The third had a long tear down the back that would require careful patching. "I can have them ready by Wednesday evening. It will be $2 for all 3. "That is fair," Nathan said. He pulled out a leather pouch and counted out the coins into her palm, his fingers rough with calluses. "I will come by Wednesday after work if that suits you." "That is fine." Rose stepped back to close the door, but Nathan did not immediately turn to leave. "Miss Harper," he said quietly, "I was in town this morning getting supplies when those churchwomen were talking. I just want you to know, whatever they said, it does not change the fact that you do good work and deserve to be treated with respect." Rose felt something twist in her chest. "You do not know anything about me. I know you are standing here earning an honest living instead of doing any number of easier things you could be doing," Nathan said. That tells me what I need to know." He settled his hat back on his head and nodded to her. "I will see you Wednesday, Miss Harper." He turned and descended the stairs before Rose could formulate a response, leaving her standing in the doorway with his shirts in her arms and an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She closed the door and carried the shirts to her work table, spreading them out to assess the repairs more carefully. Her hands moved automatically, threading a needle and beginning the delicate work of reinforcing seams, but her mind kept returning to Nathan Jenkins and the matter-of-fact way he had defended her. Most men in her experience wanted something from women like her, saw her past as an invitation rather than a history she had survived. But Nathan had simply acknowledged her work and moved on, treating her like any other person providing a service. Rose worked through the afternoon, finishing one shirt completely and making good progress on the second before the light began to fail. She lit her lamp and continued working by its flickering glow, finding a strange peace in the repetitive motions of needle and thread. By the time she finally set the mending aside and prepared for bed, she realized she had gone several hours without thinking about the church women and their condemning whispers. Monday morning arrived with a cold wind that promised an early winter. Rose delivered the completed mending to Mrs. Chen's customers and collected her wages, then spent the afternoon working on Nathan's shirts. She found herself taking extra care with the repairs, making sure each stitch was perfectly even, each button securely fastened. The torn shirt required a patch, and she carefully cut a piece of fabric from an old shirt of similar color, matching the weave as closely as possible before sewing it in place with tiny, nearly invisible stitches. Tuesday brought rain that drummed against the roof and turned the streets to mud. Rose stayed inside, finishing Nathan's final shirt, and then starting on a dress that needed the hem let down for a growing girl. Mrs. Chen brought her tea in the late afternoon and sat with her for a while, the two women working in comfortable silence. "That cowboy who came on Sunday," Mrs. Chen said eventually, her English still heavily accented after 20 years in America. "He seems like a good man." Rose kept her eyes on her stitching. "He seems polite enough." "Polite is not the same as good," Mrs. Chen said. "But I watched him. He looks at you like you are a person, not a story. That is rare." Rose did not know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded and continued working. Mrs. Chen patted her hand and returned to her own quarters, leaving Rose alone with her thoughts and the sound of rain. Wednesday arrived clear and cold. Rose spent the morning doing laundry, her hands red and raw from the harsh soap and icy water. She hung the clothes to dry in the weak autumn sun, and then returned to her room to clean up before Nathan arrived. She told herself she was simply maintaining professional standards, but she could not quite explain why she changed into her better work dress, or why she brushed her brown hair until it shone before pinning it back up. Nathan arrived just as the sun was setting, his boots clean of mud and his hat in his hands once again. Rose had his 3 shirts folded neatly on her small table, and she handed them to him with a feeling she could not quite name. He unfolded each shirt carefully, examining her work with an attention to detail that surprised her. "This is fine stitching," he said, running his thumb over the patch on the 3rd shirt. "I can barely see where the tear was." "That is the point of good mending," Rose said, but she could not help the small smile that tugged at her lips. Nathan looked at her then, really looked at her, and Rose felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exposures of her past. "Would you consider having dinner with me, Miss Harper?" he asked. "There is a restaurant 2 streets over that serves decent food, and I would welcome the company." Rose's first instinct was to refuse. Getting close to anyone in Sheridan seemed like inviting more pain, more judgment, more whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. But something in Nathan's steady gaze, in the straightforward way he asked without presumption or expectation, made her hesitate. "The church women will have even more to say if they see us together," she said quietly. "Then they will have something to say," Nathan replied. "I have never put much stock in gossip, Miss Harper. I would rather judge people by what I see with my own eyes." Rose studied him for a long moment, this cowboy who had appeared in her life just days ago, but who seemed to see her more clearly than people she had known for months. "I would like that," she heard herself say. "Give me a moment to get my shawl." She wrapped her warmest shawl around her shoulders and followed Nathan down the stairs and into the cooling evening. The restaurant he led her to was small and plain, run by a German couple who served hearty food to the ranch hands and miners who came through town. The proprietor's wife, a plump woman named Greta, gave Rose a curious look but seated them without comment at a small table near the back. Nathan ordered beef stew and bread for both of them, and when it arrived steaming hot and fragrant with herbs, Rose realized how hungry she was. She had been eating sparingly to save money, making her small wages stretch as far as possible. The stew was rich and filling, and she ate with genuine appetite while Nathan told her about his work at the Double R Ranch. "I have been working cattle since I was 14, he said, tearing off a piece of bread. "Started in Texas after my parents died of fever. Worked my way north through Kansas and Nebraska, following the herds and the work. I have been wanting to settle somewhere more permanent, and the Double R Ranch is looking for steady hands. The owner, Mr. Roberts, seems like a fair man." "What made you choose Sheridan?" Rose asked. Nathan was quiet for a moment, his green eyes thoughtful. "I was tired of drifting, tired of never staying anywhere long enough to build something. The mountains here reminded me of a place my father used to talk about, somewhere he had always wanted to take my mother and me. We never made it before they died, but being here feels like finishing something for him." Rose understood that impulse more than she could say. "I came here to start over," she found herself admitting. "I thought if I could get far enough away from Kansas City, I could be someone different." "You are not different," Nathan said. "You are just yourself, without the weight of other people's expectations." "The church women would disagree," Rose said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Nathan set down his spoon and leaned forward slightly. "Those women do not know you, Rose. They know a story, and they have decided that story defines you. But I have met plenty of people with pristine pasts who were rotten to the core. And I have met people who have survived things that would break most folks and came out stronger for it." He paused, his gaze intense. "Your past does not make you unclean. It makes you strong." Rose felt tears pricking at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. No one had ever said anything like that to her, had ever suggested that surviving 6 years in a brothel was anything other than shameful. "You do not know what I did," she whispered. "You survived," Nathan said simply. "You did what you had to do, and then you got out and made a different life. That takes more courage than most people will ever have to show." They finished their meal in a silence that felt companionable rather than awkward. Nathan walked her back to Mrs. Chen's shop as full darkness settled over Sheridan, the mountain peaks black silhouettes against a sky filled with stars. At the base of the stairs, he paused. "Would you consider letting me call on you again?" he asked. "I would like to get to know you better, if you are willing." Rose knew she should say no. Getting involved with anyone was dangerous when her past could be used against her, when the respectable people of Sheridan had already decided she was beyond redemption. But Nathan was looking at her with those steady green eyes, and she found herself nodding before her practical side could intervene. "I would like that," she said softly. Nathan smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his rugged face into something almost handsome. "Then I will see you Sunday after church, if that suits you. Maybe we could take a walk, if the weather holds." Rose agreed, and Nathan tipped his hat to her, before heading back toward the livery stable where he had left his horse. She climbed the stairs to her room, feeling lighter than she had in months, a small seed of hope taking root in her chest, despite all her efforts to remain practical and protected. The rest of the week passed slowly. Rose worked on her mending and laundry, ignoring the cold shoulders and whispered comments when she had to venture out for supplies. Mrs. Chen provided quiet support, bringing her tea and occasionally sharing stories from her own life, tales of discrimination and perseverance that made Rose feel less alone. Sunday arrived bright and cold. Rose dressed in her church clothes again, despite knowing what awaited her there. She had decided she would not let the judgment of others drive her away from the one place in town where people gathered for community, even if that community had rejected her. She would hold her head high and endure their whispers, and then she would meet Nathan and remember that at least one person in Sheridan saw her as something other than her past. The service was as difficult as she had expected. The other women shifted away from her in the pews, pulling their skirts aside as if her very presence might contaminate them. The preacher, a thin man with a voice like gravel, chose to speak about purity and redemption, his eyes sliding over Rose with barely concealed disdain. She sat through it all with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on the rough wooden cross that hung on the wall, counting the minutes until she could escape. When the service finally ended, Rose stood to leave and found her path blocked by three women she recognized from her first weeks in Sheridan. Sarah Mitchell, the banker's wife, stood at the center, her plump face set in lines of righteous disapproval. Flanking her were Martha Davidson and Ruth Porter, both married to prominent ranchers, both wearing expressions of grim satisfaction. "Miss Harper," Sarah said loudly enough that several nearby conversations stopped. "We have been discussing your situation, and we feel it would be best for everyone if you found another town to make your home. Sheridan is a respectable community, and your presence here is an affront to decent Christian women." Rose felt heat flooding her face, but she kept her voice level. "I have done nothing to offend anyone since arriving in Sheridan. I work hard, pay my debts, and keep to myself." "Your very existence offends us," Martha Davidson said, her thin lips pressed into a tight line. "A woman who has sold her body has no place among respectable people." "I never sold anything," Rose said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to control it. "I was sold. There is a difference." "The result is the same," Ruth Porter said primly. "You are damaged goods, Miss Harper, and no amount of honest work will wash away that stain." Rose opened her mouth to respond, but a deep voice cut through the tension before she could speak. "That is enough." Nathan had appeared beside her, still in his work clothes rather than Sunday finery, his hat in his hands, but his expression harder than Rose had ever seen it. He looked at each of the three women in turn, his green eyes cold. "You claim to be Christian women, but I do not hear any Christianity in your words. I hear cruelty and judgment, neither of which I recall Jesus preaching much about." Sarah Mitchell drew herself up, her face flushing. "Mr. Jenkins, you are new to this town and do not understand the situation. This woman has a past that makes her unsuitable for decent society." "This woman has a name," Nathan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And her past makes her strong, not unsuitable. She survived things that would have broken you, Mrs. Mitchell, and she came out the other side with more grace and dignity than you are showing right now." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. Rose could see curiosity and disapproval on most faces, but here and there she caught glimpses of sympathy, of people who perhaps were tired of the churchwomen's relentless judgment. "You defend her because you do not know the truth," Martha Davidson said. "She was a prostitute in Kansas City. She admitted it herself." "She was a child sold into slavery," Nathan corrected, his voice carrying across the now silent church. 16 years old when her father traded her to pay his gambling debts. She survived 6 years in hell, and then she escaped and built a new life through her own hard work. That is the truth, Mrs. Davidson. And if you cannot see the courage in that, then you are blind." Rose stared at him, her heart pounding. She had told him nothing about her past, beyond the vague admission that she had come from Kansas City to start over. How did he know the details of what had happened to her? Nathan glanced at her, and she saw understanding in his eyes. "Mrs. Chen told me," he said quietly. "She thought I should know the whole story before I decided whether to pursue your company, and hearing it only made me more certain that you were someone worth knowing." The three churchwomen looked between Nathan and Rose, their expressions ranging from shock to fury. Sarah Mitchell recovered first, drawing her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Then you are as lost as she is, Mr. Jenkins. Birds of a feather, they say. Good day." She swept past them, Martha and Ruth following in her wake like ducklings. The crowd began to disperse, conversation starting up in low, excited tones. Rose stood frozen, unsure whether to be grateful or furious that Nathan had exposed her story so publicly. "I am sorry," Nathan said, turning to face her fully. "I know that was not my story to tell, but I could not stand there and let them tear you down without someone speaking the truth." Rose took a shaking breath. "Now everyone knows." "Everyone already knew," Nathan said gently. "The church women made sure of that. The difference is now some folks might understand that there is more to the story than just condemnation." Rose looked around the church and saw that Nathan might be right. A few people were watching them, with expressions that seemed more thoughtful than hostile. Mrs. Chen had appeared from somewhere and was nodding approvingly at Nathan. And the preacher, surprisingly, was looking at the departing church women with what might have been disapproval on his gaunt face. "I need some air," Rose said, suddenly desperate to be out of the confining church with its weight of judgment and revelation. She pushed past Nathan and hurried outside into the cold autumn sunshine. Nathan followed her, keeping a respectful distance as she walked quickly away from the church toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land. The Bighorn Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Rose walked until she reached a spot where the land sloped down toward a creek, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. She stopped there, wrapping her arms around herself, and finally let the tears come. They were not just tears for what had happened in the church, but for everything. For the 16-year-old girl who had been betrayed by her own father. For the 6 years of survival that had cost her more than anyone could see. For the months of trying to build a new life only to have her past follow her like a shadow. Nathan stood a few feet away, silent, his presence somehow comforting rather than intrusive. When the tears finally subsided, Rose wiped her face with her hands and turned to face him. "How much did Mrs. Chen tell you?" "Everything," Nathan said honestly. "About your father and the gambling debt, about the brothel and the madam who owned you, about how you saved every penny you could hide away for 6 years until the madam died and you saw your chance to escape, about how you have been running and rebuilding ever since." Rose nodded slowly. "And you still wanted to have dinner with me, still wanted to call on me." "More than ever," Nathan said. He took a step closer, his eyes searching her face. "Rose, I grew up poor in Texas. My father worked himself to death, trying to keep our small farm going, and my mother died of fever because we could not afford a doctor. I have seen what desperation does to people, how it forces them into choices no one should have to make. What happened to you was not your fault, and surviving it took more strength than most people have." "The church women do not see it that way," Rose said. "The church women are afraid," Nathan replied. "Afraid that if they acknowledge what really happened to you, they will have to face how fragile their own safety is. It is easier to condemn you than to admit that any of their daughters could end up in the same situation with just a few twists of bad fortune." Rose had never thought of it that way, but Nathan's words had the ring of truth. She looked at him standing there in the cold sunshine, this cowboy who had ridden into her life just a week ago, but who seemed to understand her better than people she had known far longer. "Why do you care?" she asked quietly. "You could have any number of respectable women if you wanted. Why are you standing here defending someone like me?" Nathan closed the distance between them, reaching out to gently brush a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. "Because when I look at you, I do not see someone damaged or unclean. I see someone brave and resilient who is still fighting to build a good life, despite everything that has tried to break her. And that is the kind of person I want to know, the kind of person I want in my life." Rose felt something shift in her chest, a wall she had built around her heart beginning to crack. "I do not know how to do this," she whispered, "how to let someone close, how to trust that you are not going to use my past against me when it is convenient." "Then we will figure it out together," Nathan said. He held out his hand to her, palm up, an offering rather than a demand. "One day at a time, Rose. No expectations, no pressure, just two people getting to know each other." Rose looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before placing her own hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid, and they stood there by the creek with the mountains rising in the distance and the future stretching out uncertain, but suddenly less lonely than it had been. They walked together for a while, following the creek as it wound through the scrub brush and rocky ground. Nathan told her more about his life, about the years of drifting from ranch to ranch, about the loneliness of always being the new hand, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Rose found herself talking too, carefully at first and then with growing ease, about the small moments of kindness she had experienced, about the books she loved to read when she could get her hands on them, about her dreams of someday having a house of her own, with a garden and a cat and maybe chickens. "That does not sound like too much to ask," Nathan said. "A house and a garden and some chickens." "It is more than I ever thought I would have," Rose admitted. "When I was in Kansas City, I did not think past surviving each day. The idea of a future seemed like something that happened to other people. And now?" Rose paused, watching the water tumble over the stones. "Now I think maybe I could have a future. Maybe not the one I would have had if my father had not sold me, but something good in its own way." They turned back toward town as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks. Nathan walked her back to Mrs. Chen's shop, and at the base of the stairs, he squeezed her hand gently. "Can I see you again?" he asked. Maybe next Sunday, if you are willing to brave church again, or any other day you have free. I work most days, Rose said, but I could meet you on Wednesday evening after I finish the mending. Maybe we could have dinner again. Nathan's face lit up with a smile that made him look younger. Wednesday evening it is. I will come by at 6 if that suits you. Rose agreed, and she climbed the stairs, feeling the warmth of his hand still lingering on hers. Mrs. Chen was waiting in her sitting room, with tea and a knowing look on her lined face. That cowboy is a good man, she said, as Rose settled into the chair across from her. He came to me 3 days ago and asked about you, wanted to know your story before he pursued you further. I told him everything because I thought he deserved the truth, and I thought you deserved someone who knew the truth and wanted you anyway. You should have told me, Rose said, but there was no anger in her voice, only a weary gratitude. If I had told you, you would have run, Mrs. Chen said simply. You would have assumed he would reject you and pushed him away before he had the chance. This way, he learned the truth and chose you anyway, and you cannot argue with that choice. Rose could not deny the wisdom in that. Thank you, she said quietly, for telling him, for giving me a chance at something good. Mrs. Chen reached over and patted her hand. You have earned something good, Rose Harper. Do not let the church women convince you otherwise. The next few days passed in a blur of work and anticipation. Rose found herself thinking about Nathan at odd moments, remembering the way he had defended her in the church, the gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her, the solid warmth of his hand holding hers. She told herself not to get too attached, not to expect too much, but her heart seemed determined to hope, despite all her practical objections. Wednesday evening arrived cold and clear. Rose changed into her better dress and brushed her hair, then wrapped herself in her warmest shawl and went downstairs to wait. Nathan arrived precisely at 6, his face ruddy from the cold ride into town, but his eyes warm when they met hers. They returned to the German restaurant, where Greta greeted them with a knowing smile and seated them at the same table they had occupied before. Over beef stew and fresh bread, they talked easily, the conversation flowing from topic to topic. As they learned more about each other, Nathan told her about a problem horse he was training at the ranch, and Rose described a particularly challenging dress repair she had completed that week. Tell me about the books you like to read, Nathan said as they finished their meal. You mentioned you love books when we were walking on Sunday. Rose felt a familiar longing. I do not get to read much anymore. Books are expensive, and the lending library in Sheridan will not allow me to borrow anything. She saw Nathan's expression darken and hurried to continue. But when I was younger, before everything happened, I loved stories about adventure and faraway places. My mother had a few books that she treasured, and I read them until I had them memorized. What happened to your mother? Nathan asked gently. Rose was quiet for a moment, the old grief rising up. She died when I was 14. A fever took her in the middle of winter. After she was gone, my father started drinking more, gambling more. Within a year, he had lost everything, and he sold me to pay his debts. I do not know what happened to him after that. I do not want to know. Nathan reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. I am sorry you lost her, and I am sorry your father was not the man he should have been. Sometimes I wonder what she would think of me now, Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper. Whether she would be ashamed of what I became. You did not become anything, Nathan said firmly. Things were done to you, and you survived them. Your mother would be proud of your strength, Rose. I am certain of it. Rose felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. She was not used to someone speaking to her with such conviction, such unwavering belief in her worth. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. After dinner, Nathan walked her back through the darkening streets. At the base of the stairs, he paused and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small package wrapped in brown paper. I got you something, he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. It is not much, but I thought you might like it. Rose unwrapped the package carefully and found herself holding a book. The cover was worn, but still intact, and when she opened it, she saw it was a collection of poems by Walt Whitman. Her breath caught. Nathan, this is too much. Books are expensive. The general store owner owed me a favor, Nathan said, and I wanted you to have something that would bring you joy. You deserve that, Rose. Rose looked up at him, this cowboy who barely knew her, but who kept finding ways to see straight into her heart and give her exactly what she needed. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." Nathan smiled and reached up to gently tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "Can I kiss you, Rose?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Rose's heart was pounding, a mixture of desire and fear warring inside her. She had been kissed before, too many times to count, but those had been transactions, performances, things she endured rather than chose. This was different. Nathan was asking, giving her the choice, and that simple act of respect meant everything. "Yes," she whispered. Nathan leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was soft and brief, a question rather than a demand, and when he pulled back, Rose found herself wanting more. She reached up and pulled him down for another kiss, this one deeper, and felt his arms come around her waist, holding her carefully, as if she were something precious. When they finally parted, both were breathing heavily, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably let you get inside before we both freeze," he said, reluctance clear in his voice. "Probably," Rose agreed, but she made no move to step away. Nathan laughed softly and kissed her forehead before stepping back. "When can I see you again?" "Sunday," Rose suggested. "After church, if I can bear to go back." "You do not have to go if it is too hard," Nathan said. "Those women have no right to drive you away from worship, but your peace of mind matters more than proving a point." Rose thought about that. "I want to go," she said slowly. "I want to show them that I will not be shamed into hiding, but I would appreciate having you there." "Then I will be there," Nathan promised. "I will meet you at the church." They said goodnight reluctantly, and Rose climbed the stairs to her room with the book clutched to her chest and the memory of Nathan's kiss warming her despite the cold. She spent the evening reading the poems by lamplight, losing herself in Whitman's words about nature and humanity and connection, and for the first time in years, she felt something that might have been happiness. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Rose worked during the week, her skilled fingers mending and sewing, while her mind drifted to thoughts of Nathan. They met on Wednesdays for dinner and on Sundays after church, where Rose continued to endure the cold shoulders and whispered comments with her head held high and Nathan's steady presence beside her. Gradually, she noticed that the whispers were becoming less frequent, and a few people had even begun to nod at her in greeting when she passed them on the street. "You are wearing them down," Nathan observed one Sunday as they walked along the creek that had become their special place. It was late October now, and the aspens on the mountainsides had turned gold, shimmering in the afternoon sun. "They cannot keep up that level of outrage forever, especially when you keep being exactly who you are and refusing to be ashamed." "Mrs. Chen says the same thing," Rose said. "She says persistence is its own kind of power." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their hands linked. Rose had grown used to the feel of Nathan's hand in hers, the way his thumb would absently stroke her knuckles, the solid warmth that seemed to anchor her when her thoughts spiraled into old fears. "Rose," Nathan said eventually, his tone suddenly serious. "I have been thinking about something, and I want to talk to you about it." Rose's stomach clenched with automatic anxiety. In her experience, serious conversations rarely ended well. "What is it?" Nathan stopped walking and turned to face her, keeping hold of her hands. "I am falling in love with you," he said simply. "I know we have only known each other for 6 weeks, but I feel more for you than I have felt for anyone in my life, and I wanted you to know that, so you understand where I am coming from with what I'm about to ask." Rose's heart was hammering so hard she was certain Nathan could hear it. "What are you asking?" "I want to marry you," Nathan said. "Not right away, if you are not ready, but someday, when you feel like you can trust me with your whole heart. I want to build a life with you, Rose. I want to give you that house with the garden and the chickens. I want to wake up next to you every morning and know that you are mine and I am yours." Rose felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "Nathan, I am not the kind of woman men marry. I am the kind they use and discard." "You are the kind of woman I want to marry," Nathan said firmly. "The only kind, smart and brave and beautiful and determined. You have survived things that would have destroyed me, and you keep fighting for a better life. That is exactly who I want as my partner." "What about children?" Rose asked, voicing one of her deepest fears. "What if I cannot have them after everything that happened to me? What if my body is too damaged? Then we will not have children, Nathan said. Or we will find other ways to build a family. There are always children who need homes, Rose. What matters to me is you, not some theoretical future that may or may not happen. Rose pulled her hands free and walked a few steps away, wrapping her arms around herself. She wanted to say yes more than she had ever wanted anything, but the fear was enormous. What if you change your mind? She whispered. What if someday you decide my past is too much, that you cannot live with the knowledge of what I did? Nathan came up behind her and gently turned her to face him. Rose, look at me. When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, his voice steady and sure. You did not do anything. Things were done to you, and even if you had made choices you regret, even if your past was entirely different, it would not change how I feel about you now. I am not some boy who thinks love means everything is perfect. I am a man who knows that love means choosing someone, despite the imperfections, despite the scars, despite the difficult histories. And I choose you, Rose Harper. Every day, I choose you. The wall around Rose's heart finally crumbled completely. She threw her arms around Nathan's neck and kissed him fiercely, pouring all her fear and hope and desperate longing into that kiss. Nathan's arms came around her, holding her tight, and they stood there by the creek with the golden aspens shimmering above them and made silent promises with their bodies that their words had already spoken. When they finally pulled apart, Rose was crying in earnest, but these were different tears than the ones she had shed so many times before. These were tears of relief, of joy, of finally allowing herself to believe that she might deserve happiness after all. Yes, she said, her voice shaking. Yes, I will marry you. Not someday. Soon. I do not want to wait, Nathan. I have spent so many years in fear and shame, and I am tired of waiting for life to start. I want to marry you and build that life we both want. Nathan's face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen from him. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the moment. We will need to talk to the preacher, Nathan said practically, though his eyes were dancing with joy. And I will need to find us a place to live. The bunkhouse at the ranch is no place for a married couple. Mrs. Chen has a small house she rents out on the edge of town, Rose said, her mind already racing ahead. She mentioned it to me once. It has 2 rooms and a kitchen, and there is space for a garden. Then we will talk to her, Nathan agreed. How soon do you want to do this, Rose? What do you need to feel ready? Rose thought about it. A month, she suggested. That gives us time to find a house and for me to make a dress. And time for you to be absolutely certain this is what you want. I am already certain, Nathan said. But a month is good. That will take us to the end of November. We can be married before the first heavy snows come. They walked back to town in a daze of happiness, making plans and dreaming aloud about their future. When they reached Mrs. Chen's shop, they found the older woman sitting in her front room with tea, as if she had been waiting for them. One look at their faces and she smiled. I see congratulations are in order, she said, gesturing for them both to sit. When is the wedding? How did you know? Rose asked, though she could not help smiling. I have eyes, Mrs. Chen said. That cowboy has been looking at you like you are the sun and moon for weeks now. It was only a matter of time before he asked you to marry him. She poured tea for them both. Now, tell me your plans. They spent the next hour discussing practical matters with Mrs. Chen, who proved to be an invaluable resource. She confirmed that her rental house was available and offered it to them at a price Nathan could afford on his ranch wages. She also offered to help Rose make a wedding dress and insisted on hosting a small celebration dinner after the ceremony. You may not have family here, Mrs. Chen said firmly, but you have friends. You will not get married without at least a few people to celebrate with you. Rose felt tears threatening again, but these were happy tears. She reached across the small table and squeezed Mrs. Chen's hand. Thank you for everything. For giving me work when I first came to Sheridan, for believing in me, for telling Nathan my story. You have been more of a mother to me this past year than anyone since I lost my own mother. Mrs. Chen patted her hand, her own eyes suspiciously bright. You remind me of myself at your age, she said, lost and determined and stronger than you knew. I am happy to see you finding joy, Rose. You have earned it. Nathan left reluctantly that evening, needing to return to the ranch before full darkness fell. Rose walked him to where his horse was tied at the hitching post, and they stood together in the growing dusk, reluctant to part. 1 month, Nathan said, pulling her close, and then you will be my wife, and I will never have to leave you at the end of the evening again. 1 month, Rose agreed, and they sealed the promise with a kiss that left them both breathless. The next 4 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Rose worked longer hours to save extra money for their household. Nathan began moving his few possessions into the rental house and making small repairs to ready it for them. Mrs. Chen helped Rose design and sew a wedding dress of deep blue wool, practical but pretty, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs that Rose worked on by lamplight each evening. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Sheridan. The church women were predictably scandalized, but Rose found that their disapproval bothered her less with each passing day. She had Nathan's love and Mrs. Chen's friendship and the promise of a future that was entirely her own choosing. What the church women thought seemed increasingly irrelevant. To Rose's surprise, there were people who offered quiet support. Greta from the restaurant sent over a loaf of fresh bread with her congratulations. The general store owner, a laconic man named Tom Fletcher, offered Nathan a good price on supplies for the new house. And a few of the younger women in town, those less firmly under the church women's influence, began to smile at Rose when they passed her on the street. "You are becoming respectable by association," Nathan teased one Wednesday evening as they sat together in the tiny parlor of their soon-to-be home, painting the walls a cheerful cream color. "Marrying a working cowboy elevates your status. Or maybe people are just realizing that I am a person, not a scandal," Rose suggested. She dipped her brush in the paint and carefully applied it to the wall, enjoying the simple domesticity of the task. "Either way, I will take it." Nathan set down his own brush and came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Are you happy, Rose?" Rose leaned back against him, savoring his warmth and solidity. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," she said honestly. "Sometimes I wake up and have to remind myself that this is real, that you are real, and this life we are building is actually happening." "It is real," Nathan murmured against her hair, "and it is only going to get better." They worked on the house whenever they both had free time, slowly transforming the 2 bare rooms into a real home. Nathan built shelves for Rose's few books and her sewing supplies. Rose made curtains for the windows and cushions for the chairs they had bought secondhand. Together, they planted a small garden that would hopefully survive the winter and produce vegetables come spring. The week before the wedding, Nathan presented Rose with a pair of chickens in a carefully constructed coop he had built behind the house. Rose laughed with pure delight, remembering her dream of a house with a garden and chickens, and threw her arms around Nathan's neck. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything you tell me," Nathan replied, kissing her soundly. "You are going to have your dream, Rose. All of it." The day before the wedding, Rose sat with Mrs. Chen in the older woman's parlor, putting the finishing touches on her dress. The embroidery was complete, tiny flowers and vines that climbed the collar and cuffs, and Rose had added a few buttons she had carved from horn, each one polished to a soft sheen. "You have done beautiful work," Mrs. Chen said, examining the dress critically. "You should be proud." "I am," Rose said. She set down her needle and looked at the woman who had become her dearest friend. "Mrs. Chen, I want to thank you properly for everything you have done for me. You took me in when no one else would give me work. You defended me when others were cruel. You told Nathan my story and gave me a chance at love. I do not know how to repay any of that." Mrs. Chen set down her own sewing and reached over to take Rose's hands. "You repay me by being happy," she said firmly. "By building a good life with that cowboy and showing this town that a person's worth is not determined by their past. You repay me by surviving and thriving, Rose. That is all I ask." They embraced, 2 women who had both known hardship and prejudice, who had both fought for their places in an unforgiving world. When they pulled apart, both were wiping away tears. "Now," Mrs. Chen said briskly, returning to her practical self, "let us make sure everything is ready for tomorrow. The preacher has agreed to perform the ceremony at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I have arranged for the dinner to be here afterward. Tom Fletcher and his wife will come, and Greta and her husband, and a few others who have been kind to you. It will be a small gathering, but a warm one." Rose felt overwhelmed by gratitude. She had expected to be married quietly with only Nathan and Mrs. Chen as witnesses, perhaps not even in the church given the preacher's previous coldness toward her. but Mrs. Chen had apparently been working behind the scenes to create a real celebration. "I do not know what to say," Rose whispered. "Say nothing," Mrs. Chen replied. "Just enjoy your wedding day tomorrow. You have earned that much happiness." Rose's wedding day dawned clear and cold, the last day of November in 1878. She woke early in her small room above Mrs. Chen's shop, the room she would be leaving behind after today. She lay in bed for a moment, watching the winter sunlight creep across the ceiling and thinking about how much her life had changed in the 5 months since Nathan Jenkins had first knocked on her door asking for his shirts to be mended. She rose and washed carefully, then pinned up her hair with extra care, leaving a few soft curls to frame her face. Mrs. Chen helped her into the blue wool dress, fastening the many small buttons up the back and adjusting the collar so the embroidery showed to best advantage. When Rose looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This woman looked happy, looked loved, looked nothing like the scared girl who had run from Kansas City, or the weary woman who had arrived in Sheridan searching for a place to hide. "You are beautiful," Mrs. Chen said softly. "Nathan is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Rose replied, but she smiled as she said it. They walked to the church together just before 2 o'clock. Rose carried a small bouquet of dried flowers that Mrs. Chen had arranged, the best that could be managed in the late November. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. She was eager now, ready to start this new chapter of her life. Nathan was waiting at the church entrance, dressed in his best clothes, with his hair freshly cut and his face cleanly shaven. When he saw Rose, his whole face lit up with such joy that Rose felt her own heart expand in response. He came forward and took her hand, raising it to his lips. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "So do you," Rose replied, and they both laughed, the nervous energy breaking into something lighter. The preacher was waiting inside, his expression neutral, but not unkind. To Rose's surprise, the small church was not empty. About 20 people had gathered in the pews, most of them faces she barely knew. Tom Fletcher and his wife were there, as promised, and Greta and her husband. But there were also ranch hands from the Double R, men Nathan worked with who had come to support their friend, and scattered throughout the pews were a few of the younger women from town, those who had begun smiling at Rose on the street along with their husbands. At the very back, looking distinctly uncomfortable but present nonetheless, sat the church women, Sarah Mitchell and Martha Davidson and Ruth Porter. They were not smiling, but they were there, bearing witness. Rose suspected Mrs. Chen had something to do with their attendance, and she felt a surge of affection for the older woman's determination to force the town to acknowledge Rose's new respectability. The ceremony itself was brief. The preacher spoke about commitment and faith, about building a life together through hard times and good. Nathan and Rose exchanged the simple vows, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. When Nathan slid a plain gold band onto Rose's finger, his hand was steady, his eyes locked on hers with absolute certainty. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher said. "You may kiss your bride." Nathan pulled Rose close and kissed her thoroughly, to the point where someone in the pews cleared their throat loudly and several people laughed. When they finally broke apart, both flushed and grinning, the small congregation applauded. They walked back down the aisle together as Mr. and Mrs. Nathan Jenkins, Rose's hand tucked into the crook of Nathan's arm. The church women remained seated as they passed, their faces still set in lines of disapproval, but even they could not entirely diminish the joy of the moment. Outside the church, well-wishers crowded around them with congratulations and handshakes. Tom Fletcher clapped Nathan on the back and told him he was a lucky man. Greta hugged Rose and whispered that she had made the restaurant's special cake for the celebration dinner. The ranch hands teased Nathan good-naturedly about married life, while looking at Rose with respect. Mrs. Chen's dinner was everything Rose could have hoped for, and more. The older woman had prepared a feast that filled her small dining room with delicious smells. Roast chicken and potatoes, fresh bread, vegetables preserved from the autumn harvest, and Greta's special cake, which turned out to be a towering creation of layers and cream that made everyone exclaim with delight. They ate and talked and laughed late into the evening. Nathan kept Rose's hand in his whenever it was practical, as if he could not bear to not be touching her. Rose felt herself relaxing completely, for perhaps the first time in her adult life. Surrounded by people who were genuinely happy for her, celebrated by a community that was slowly learning to see past her history to the person she actually was. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Mrs. Chen pulled Rose aside. "The house is ready for you," she said. "Nathan brought over your things earlier today, and I made sure there was food in the kitchen and wood for the stove. Everything you need to start your married life." Rose embraced her tightly. "Thank you. For everything. I could not have done any of this without you." "You could have," Mrs. Chen said. "But I am glad you did not have to. Now go with your husband, Rose Jenkins. Be happy." Nathan drove them to the little house on the edge of town in a borrowed wagon, the winter stars brilliant overhead. He helped Rose down and then swept her up into his arms, carrying her over the threshold despite her laughing protests. Inside, the house was warm from the fire someone had laid in the stove, and lamplight glowed softly, casting everything in a golden light. Nathan set Rose down gently in the middle of their small parlor and cupped her face in his hands. "Hello, wife," he said softly. "Hello, husband," Rose replied, and the words felt like magic on her tongue. They came together slowly, kissing with a tenderness that gradually deepened into passion. When Nathan began to unbutton Rose's dress, his fingers gentle and unhurried, she felt a moment of old fear rise up. But Nathan must have sensed it, because he paused and looked into her eyes. "We do not have to do anything tonight," he said. "We have all the time in the world, Rose. I want you to feel safe with me." Rose took a shaking breath and reached up to touch his face. "I do feel safe with you," she said. "That is why I am frightened. I have never done this because I wanted to before. I do not know how to let myself want you without all the old memories crowding in." "Then we go slowly," Nathan said. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the corner of her mouth. "And if you need me to stop at any point, you tell me. Your comfort matters more to me than anything else." They moved to the bedroom, where Mrs. Chen had made up the bed with fresh linens. Nathan continued to undress Rose with infinite patience, pausing frequently to kiss her and murmur reassurances. When Rose reached for the buttons of his shirt with trembling hands, he stood still and let her set the pace. What happened between them that night was nothing like Rose's experiences in the brothel. Nathan was gentle and attentive, checking in with her constantly, making sure she was comfortable and present rather than lost in old trauma. When she tensed at certain touches or movements, he immediately changed what he was doing, finding ways to bring her pleasure without triggering her fears. And when they finally came together, it was as equals, as partners choosing each other freely. And Rose felt something inside her heal that she had not even known was broken. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, Nathan's arms around her and Rose's head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Nathan asked, his hand stroking gently through her hair. "For making it beautiful," Rose said. "For being patient with me. For not being angry when I was frightened." Nathan pulled her closer. "Rose, I love you. That means all of you, including the parts that are scared or hurt. We will always go at your pace, and I will always make sure you feel safe. That is what marriage means to me." Rose fell asleep in Nathan's arms, feeling more content than she had ever thought possible. She woke the next morning to find Nathan already up, stoking the fire in the kitchen stove and making coffee. He smiled when he saw her standing in the doorway wrapped in her dressing gown. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins," he said, and Rose felt her heart flutter at hearing her new name. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," she replied, crossing the small kitchen to kiss him. They spent their first days of marriage settling into their new life together. Nathan continued working at the Double R Ranch, leaving early each morning and returning in the evening to find Rose had prepared dinner and made their small house increasingly comfortable. Rose continued taking in mending and laundry, building up her savings and her reputation for quality work. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, Nathan reading aloud from Rose's books or telling stories from his years of drifting while Rose sewed or knitted. As December progressed and snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the Bighorn Mountains and turning Sheridan into a winter landscape, Rose found herself falling more deeply in love with her husband with each passing day. Nathan was endlessly patient with her fears and triggers, never pressuring her, always making sure she felt safe. He made her laugh with his dry observations about the other ranch hands. He brought her small gifts, wild flowers he found on his rides, or interesting rocks from the creek. And he told her daily that he loved her, not just with his words, but with his actions, with the way he looked at her, as if she were the most precious thing in his world. Christmas arrived quietly. They had little money for gifts, but Nathan had carved Rose a beautiful wooden box for her sewing supplies, and Rose had knitted Nathan a thick scarf to keep him warm on his cold rides to and from the ranch. They shared a simple dinner with Mrs. Chen and attended Christmas service at the church, where the congregation was slightly friendlier than before, the season perhaps softening some hearts. In February, as winter began its slow retreat and the first hints of spring appeared in the lengthening days, Rose realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week before saying anything to Nathan, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed. But when another week passed and she began to feel queasy in the mornings, she finally told him. Nathan's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Terrified," Rose admitted, "and happy." "Is that strange?" "Not at all," Nathan said. He pulled back and cupped her face in his hands. "We are going to be wonderful parents, Rose. This child is going to be so loved." "What if something goes wrong?" Rose whispered, voicing her deepest fear. "What if my body cannot carry a baby after everything that happened to me?" "Then we will face that together," Nathan said firmly. "But let us not borrow trouble, Rose. Let us just take each day as it comes and trust that we will handle whatever happens." Rose visited the town doctor, a gruff man named Callahan, who examined her briskly and confirmed her pregnancy. "You are healthy enough," he said. "Should deliver sometime in early October if my calculations are correct. Take it easy, eat well, and come see me if you have any problems." The months of Rose's pregnancy passed in a blur. Her body changed, swelling with new life, and she found the transformation both miraculous and frightening. Nathan was endlessly attentive, taking over the heavier household chores and insisting Rose rest more than she wanted to. Mrs. Chen provided a steady stream of advice and herbal teas that were supposed to ease the nausea and fatigue. By summer, Rose's condition was obvious to everyone in Sheridan. She received a mixture of reactions. Some people were genuinely happy for her and Nathan, offering congratulations and advice. Others, particularly the church women, seemed scandalized that a woman with Rose's past was going to be a mother. Rose tried not to let their disapproval bother her, but sometimes she caught herself wondering if they were right, if someone like her had any business raising a child. Nathan always seemed to know when she was spiraling into these dark thoughts. He would pull her close and remind her of her strength, of all the ways she had already proven herself capable of love and commitment. "You are going to be an amazing mother," he would say. "Our child is lucky to have you." In late September, as the aspens once again turned gold on the mountainsides, Rose went into labor. Nathan rode at breakneck speed to fetch Dr. Callahan and Mrs. Chen, then paced the small house like a caged animal, while Rose labored in their bedroom, with Mrs. Chen attending her. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, but finally, as the afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom window, Rose gave birth to a squalling, red-faced baby boy. Dr. Callahan cleaned up the infant and placed him in Rose's arms. "Healthy lungs on this one," he said with satisfaction. "Good strong heartbeat. You did well, Mrs. Jenkins." Rose stared down at her son, overwhelmed by the rush of love that flooded through her. He was perfect, with a dusting of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air as he cried. Nathan was allowed into the room a moment later, and he approached the bed with awe written all over his face. "A son," Rose said softly. "We have a son, Nathan." Nathan reached out with one finger and gently touched the baby's cheek. "He is beautiful. You are both beautiful." He looked at Rose with tears in his eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me this family, Rose. I never thought I would have this." They named the baby Matthew Nathan Jenkins, and he became the center of their world. Nathan proved to be a devoted father, taking over night feedings when he could, and walking the floor with Matthew when the baby was fussy. Rose discovered depths of fierce protectiveness in herself she had never known existed. She would do anything to keep this child safe, to make sure he grew up knowing he was loved and wanted and valued. As Matthew grew from an infant to a toddler, Rose and Nathan's life in Sheridan continued to solidify. Nathan was promoted to foreman at the Double R Ranch, which came with better pay and more respect in the community. Rose's mending business thrived, and she began to teach sewing to some of the younger women in town, who were curious about her skills and increasingly willing to overlook her scandalous past in favor of learning from her expertise. The church women never fully accepted Rose, but their active hostility faded into a cold tolerance, and gradually Rose found she cared less and less what they thought. She had a husband who loved her, a son who delighted her, a home of her own, and friends who valued her. She had built the life she dreamed of, against all odds, and their disapproval could not take that away from her. When Matthew was 2 years old, Rose discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because her body had healed more than she had thought possible. In the spring of 1881, she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Ellen, after Nathan's mother and Rose's own mother. Sarah had her father's green eyes and her mother's determination, and from the moment she entered the world, she had her older brother wrapped around her tiny finger. The years passed in the steady rhythm of family life. Nathan continued working at the Double R Ranch, eventually buying a small piece of land adjacent to the ranch where they built a larger house with room for their growing family. Rose continued her sewing business from home, teaching her skills to Sarah as the girl grew old enough to learn. Matthew showed an early aptitude for working with horses like his father, and by the time he was 10, he was helping Nathan train the younger animals. In 1885, when Rose was 30, Mrs. Chen died peacefully in her sleep. Rose grieved deeply for the woman who had been her first real friend in Sheridan, who had given her work and shelter and the courage to pursue happiness. At the funeral, Rose stood with Nathan and their children and spoke about how Mrs. Chen had saved her life through simple kindness, how she had seen past society's condemnation to the person underneath, and how Rose owed her everything. To Rose's surprise, many people in Sheridan attended the funeral, and several came up to her afterward to express their sympathies. Sarah Mitchell, grown older and perhaps slightly softened by the years, even approached Rose to say that Mrs. Chen had been a good woman who would be missed. She believed in giving people second chances, Sarah said, and there was something in her eyes that might have been regret. That was a rare quality. Rose simply nodded, not quite ready to forgive the years of cruelty, but willing to acknowledge that people could change, even if only slightly. As Rose moved through her 30s and into her 40s, she found a contentment she had never imagined possible in those dark years in Kansas City. Her children grew into fine young people. Matthew met and married a sweet girl named Emma who worked at the general store, and they gave Rose and Nathan their first grandchild, a boy named Nathan after his grandfather. Sarah showed an aptitude for numbers and ended up keeping books for several businesses in Sheridan, proud of her independence and in no hurry to marry. Nathan aged well, his hair silvering at the temples, but his body still strong from years of ranch work. Rose's own hair showed threads of gray, and her hands bore the marks of decades of needlework. But she felt more beautiful than she ever had in her youth. She was loved, and she loved in return. And that love had transformed her from the frightened girl who arrived in Sheridan into a woman who walked through life with confidence and purpose. On their 25th wedding anniversary in November of 1903, Nathan and Rose rode out to the creek where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. It was cold, and snow threatened from the gray sky, but they bundled up in warm coats and sat together on a flat rock by the water, watching it flow past, as it had for all these years. "Do you ever regret it?" Rose asked. "Marrying me, taking on all the complications that came with my past?" Nathan pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "You gave me everything I ever wanted, Rose. A home, a family, a purpose beyond just drifting from job to job. And more than that, you gave me yourself, which is the greatest gift I have ever received." "You saved me," Rose said quietly. "When I came to Sheridan, I was running and hiding, convinced I would never be anything more than my past. But you saw me differently. You saw my strength instead of my shame, and that made all the difference." "We saved each other," Nathan corrected. He turned her face toward his and kissed her gently. "I was drifting before I met you, Rose. I had no real home, no deep connections, nothing tying me to any one place or person. You gave me a reason to stay, to build something permanent. We saved each other." They sat together as the first snowflakes began to fall, watching the creek and the mountains and the wide Wyoming sky. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life of love and purpose. Rose thought about the scared 16-year-old girl she had been, The young woman who had survived 6 years of hell. The 22-year-old who had arrived in Sheridan hoping only to hide from her past. That girl could never have imagined this future, this happiness, this sense of belonging. But she had survived, and in surviving, she had found her way to Nathan, to their children, to this life that was so much richer and fuller than anything she had dared to dream. The church women had called her unclean, had tried to shame her into hiding or leaving. But Nathan had seen her truth, that her past had not broken her but made her strong, that survival was its own kind of courage, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. As they rode back to their home through the falling snow, Rose felt a profound gratitude for every twist of fate that had led her to this moment. The pain and fear of her past were real, and she would never forget them entirely, but they no longer defined her. She was Rose Jenkins, wife and mother and grandmother, respected member of the Sheridan community, survivor and thriver. And she was, at last, truly happy. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joys and challenges. Nathan retired from active ranch work in his late 50s, his body finally demanding rest after decades of hard labor. He took up woodworking in earnest, creating beautiful pieces of furniture for their children and grandchildren. Rose continued sewing as long as her hands would allow, passing on her skills to Sarah and to her granddaughters, making sure the craft that had sustained her through so many hard years would continue in the next generation. Matthew and Emma had 4 children in total, and Sarah eventually married a banker from a neighboring town, giving Rose and Nathan 2 more grandchildren to dote on. The house that had once held just Rose and Nathan now overflowed with family on holidays and special occasions, filled with laughter and love and the rich chaos of multiple generations gathered together. On a warm summer evening in 1910, Rose and Nathan sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set behind the Bighorn Mountains. They were both in their mid-50s now, still healthy but slowing down, aware that they had entered the final chapter of their lives together. Their grandchildren played in the yard, their shouts and laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "We did well," Nathan said, reaching over to take Rose's hand. "Look at all of this, Rose. Look at what we built together." Rose squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "We did," she agreed. "When I think about where I started, about how impossible all of this seemed, I can hardly believe it is real." "It is real," Nathan said. "Every bit of it. And it all started because you were brave enough to keep going, to keep fighting for a better life even when it seemed hopeless. Your strength made all of this possible, Rose." Rose leaned her head on Nathan's shoulder, watching their grandchildren play as the mountains turned purple in the fading light. She had been called unclean, damaged, unworthy. But she had survived, and in surviving, she had proven that a person's worth was not determined by what had been done to them, but by what they chose to do with the life they had been given. She had chosen love. She had chosen Nathan and their children and this community that had eventually grudgingly accepted her. She had chosen to believe that she deserved happiness despite everything in her past that said otherwise. And in making those choices, she had found a life richer and more beautiful than anything she had imagined possible in those dark days in Kansas City. As the stars began to appear overhead and the grandchildren were called inside for bed, Rose and Nathan remained on the porch, hands clasped, hearts full. They had weathered every storm together, had built something lasting and good from the broken pieces of their individual pasts. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not where they had started, but where they had ended up, together. The love story of Rose Harper and Nathan Jenkins was not a fairy tale. It was something better. A real story of 2 imperfect people who found each other at exactly the right moment and chose to build a life together despite all the reasons they could have walked away. It was a story of survival and redemption, of seeing past society's judgments to the truth of a person's character, of recognizing that strength can come from the most unlikely places. And it was a story that would be told and retold by their children and grandchildren for generations to come, a reminder that love, when it is real and true and freely given, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds and transform even the most broken lives into something beautiful and whole.